This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Politi, Jan H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Scott K., Sunny H., JRM, Susie G., B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, V!V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, Christine F., Alex C., Samantha G., Alcanet, Teddy O., and Desi Ray. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. My name is Breege Burke, and our subject this week, we're kind of in a Greek mythological vein for the last few episodes, and I want to continue in this sort of Trojan War theme and talk about the center of the Trojan War herself, and that is a woman who is often referred to as Helen of Troy. Now, I only say often referred to because I really think that's a very inaccurate way to describe her. She is a child who is connected with Sparta. Her father actually is supposed to be Zeus, the god Zeus, who had mated with Leda in the form of a swan. And of course, Leda ended up laying an egg, and some versions 2 eggs, which consisted of not only Helen, but also Clytemnestra, who later became the wife of Agamemnon, and Castor and Pollux, the twins who we think of as being associated with the constellation of Gemini. And Castor and Pollux have this weird mortal-immortal thing going on. You know, one of them was mortal, one was immortal, but because they didn't want to be separated, it was like they took turns spending a day in Hades. When the one twin finally, who was mortal, did pass away. So there was kind of this back and forth between the underworld and continuing to live as immortals. Point being, of course, that whether it was a single egg or 2 eggs, we have this idea that Helen is a kind of demigoddess, and that she is a daughter of Zeus, presumably. Now, the mortal father connected to her is Tyndareus, who is she has Castor and Pollux as her brothers, and Clytemnestra is her sister. And as you can see, these are very high-ranking women who end up being married off to these men who are now the kings or the head tribal kings of their respective areas. Clytemnestra marrying Agamemnon, making her a queen of Mycenae, which is where Agamemnon was from. And of course, we see all of these names centered around the Trojan War, because Helen of herself becomes the center of that. So let's talk a bit about her. I mean, she's technically immortal, but she is immortal when the time comes for death. Herself and Menelaus pass the Elysian fields, something that's usually reserved for heroes. When you think about those who end up going to this very, very nice part of the underworld, they're always the heroes. And actually, it was in, I know when I was studying and doing the research for my dissertation, there was a discussion, I think it was Erwin Rhodey, who had talked about the fact that the ancient heroes tended to be transported. They didn't just, it was as though they didn't die. It was as though they were bodily transported to the Elysian fields without having to go through the difficulties of death. So anyway, it's interesting. This seems to have been the fate of her and Menelaus. But again, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. I'm going to talk a little bit about her birth and the stories connected to her, because there's a whole lot connected to Helen. Helen is almost kind of a centrifuge or center point, or axis, I guess you could say, around which a lot of Greek mythology centers, because she is such a central figure to the Trojan War, which is one of the central events that we see in Greek mythology. Indeed, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are the 2 major epics where we still have the 24 books of each written allegedly by Homer or by Homer and others, centers around this particular war. And there are a number of other texts that are part of what they call the epic cycle, which also talk about Helen and talk about her connection to the war, And there's also some other theories about her and about her parentage that are discussed in these places. So we're going to get into that. Now, if you've been keeping up with the Chthonia podcasts, you will know that I have covered some of this material elsewhere, so apologies for any overlap here, but these are connected subjects, particularly when it comes to her birth, because, again, we have this source. He's known as the first Vatican mythographer, was the one who had suggested that Leda, after mating with Zeus in the form of a swan, had either first had the two eggs, and then later on said no, they were all produced from a single egg, or at least that Helen, Castor, and Pollux were produced from a single egg, and that the others were separate. And so Pseudo-Apollodorus says Leda had intercourse with both Zeus and Tyndareus the night she conceived Helen. This is quite similar, actually, to the mythology of Heracles, where, Alcmene not only makes love to her husband, but also Zeus comes. So she has two children that she gives birth to, and one of them is mortal, and the other one is Heracles, who was a son of Zeus, and so therefore a demigod. So we have a very similar kind of a thing here. She is definitely a figure with some greater mythological importance because she has that parentage. She is the most beautiful woman in the world, according to legend. And as the most beautiful woman in the world, it of course would make sense that her parent would have to be a god, that no mortal could actually potentially have that level of beauty. So, okay. Now, as I've mentioned in other podcasts, particularly the one on Nemesis, Helen was the daughter of Zeus and Nemesis. Okay, that this was about Zeus pursuing Nemesis, who avoided him, and then of course once he ravished her, she was kind of filled with this kind of shame. But the child that they produced was Helen. And here, I'll just read this to you, actually, this is actually in Wikipedia, but it is a very complete account here. It says, the Cypria, which is this one work in the epic cycle, of which we have only a few lines, but it does say that Helen was the daughter of Zeus and Nemesis. The date is uncertain, but generally thought to preserve traditions that date back to at least the 7th century BCE. In the Cypria, Nemesis did not wish to mate with Zeus. She therefore changed shape into various animals as she attempted to flee Zeus, finally becoming a goose. Zeus also transformed himself into a goose and got involved with her. I'm going to avoid the R word here. Nemesis, who produced an egg from which Helen was born. Presumably, in the Cypria, this egg was somehow transferred to Leda, which again, this is Greek mythology, so pretty much anything can happen. Later sources state it was either brought to Leda by a shepherd who discovered it in a grove in Attica, or that it was dropped into her lap by Hermaeus. So, we have this idea. Regardless, Leda ends up with this egg, whether she produced the egg herself or whether Nemesis produced this egg. And some people say, there's other versions that say Zeus and Nemesis were swans rather than geese. And there's this idea of Zeus and Nemesis both transforming into birds of some kind. So so you have this idea of her being a child of Nemesis. And this ties into another story in the Cypria, which has to do with Thetis and Zeus plotting to wipe out humankind through a great war. Like, this already happened once through a flood, and now they're going to do this again through a great war. And so this is how the Trojan War came into being, and Helen, as a child of Nemesis, would be the catalyst for that war. And of course, now we know Nemesis is a child of Eris, the goddess of chaos, and Eris was the one who was snubbed when she was supposed to go to the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis. She was the only deity not invited. And that's kind of weird to me now that I stop and think about it. I'm like, surely if they didn't invite Eris because she was chaotic, I mean, so are all of her offspring. So did they invite her offspring and not her? I don't know. I always wondered about that. In any case, Eris throws in the golden apple that says Callisti to the fairest, and of course, there's other tropes like this. We see this in Celtic mythology, too. There's an example of this where choice meat is left out for the three heroes, and it's like, oh, to the one who is the bravest or most heroic of you, and all three of them go, oh, that's mine. So this idea of kind of testing people in this way is a thing. So Paris is called in, who is the son of King Priam of Troy. He's sometimes also known as Alexandros. But Paris is a shepherd, who is this shepherd prince, who is brought in to make this judgment. And of course, he makes the judgment the way anybody would make a good judgment, through bribery. So the three goddesses try to bribe him, And Aphrodite bribes him by saying, I will give you Helen as your wife. Now, the small problem with this is Helen, of course, was already married to somebody else. Okay, so then let's talk a little bit about Helen and her adventures with men as the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, we always talk about her abduction by Paris, but there is an earlier abduction that takes place. And this is her abduction by Theseus. Now, Theseus is later a king of Athens. He's also the one who is associated with the mythology of the Minotaur. Okay, he's one of those ones who was sent from Athens as a tribute to Crete, and eventually he is the one who slays the Minotaur. But this is a story that's not well known, and it's interesting to me that even some of my own myth instructors did not know this story. It is actually, I think it should be more well known than what it is, but this is a story of Theseus and his friend Pirithous. I'll read through the story as it's portrayed here. Theseus and Pirithous thought that since they were sons of gods, they should have divine wives. They thus pledged to help each other abduct 2 daughters of Zeus. Theseus chose Helen, and Pirithous vowed to marry Persephone, the wife of Hades. Now, again, I don't know if that Helen was married at this point, but obviously Persephone was. Theseus took Helen and left her with his mother Aethra, or his associate Aphidnus at Aphidnae or in Athens. Theseus abducts her and brings her back to his household. Theseus and Pirithous then travel to the underworld, the domain of Hades, to kidnap Persephone. Hades pretended to offer them hospitality and set a feast, but as soon as the pair sat down, snakes coiled around their feet and held them there. Yes, and where they were held in was often known as the chairs of forgetfulness, where they were there and they sat and they could not move. They were almost like stone. They could not escape from there. Helen's abduction caused the invasion of Athens by Castor and Pollux, who captured Aethra in revenge and returned their sister to Sparta. In good as Faust, the centaur Chiron is said to have aided the Dioscuri brothers in returning Helen home. Okay, so yes, that one I do remember that her brothers came and intervened, and of course then they took, there's this idea of when you take the wife or you take one of the women folk of a royal family, this is known as an abduction. Now, the thing is, we're using the term abduction or kidnapping, and the question sometimes becomes whether or not it's a true kidnapping or whether or not the woman went of her own free will. And this is definitely true of the situation with Helen and Paris. Does not appear to be the case with Theseus. But Herodotus had an interesting thing to say about this. In the beginning of his histories, he talks about the Argonautica. And again, Greek histories, you have to take the word history with a grain of salt. The word history does not mean the same thing that history tends to mean in our modern times. It is basically a story that is told by somebody who heard it from somebody else that they think is a credible source. And, and frequently these stories are highly questionable in terms of their facticity and whether or not they're true. But again, it's understood that the word history, we still see, like in French, for example, l'histoire. Historia is really a Greek word initially. And it means that kind of a story told by somebody that you think is a reliable narrator. In French, it just simply means a story, l'histoire, a story. It doesn't have the same gravitas as what we tend to think of as history now, where history is supposed to be a reporting of the facts or an archiving of the facts and the culture of a particular period. You have to remember, if you are archiving the culture of a particular period, you are also going to be looking at it in terms of the belief systems and the customs of that area as well. This is what we have scholars of anthropologists, for example, are going to look at all of these factors of a culture when they're looking at the history of a culture. But this is not simply a reporting of facts that, we have factual evidence that these things happened. Facts didn't really have anything to do with it. It had to do with tradition and the stories that were passed down through the bards. So the Argonautica, which if you get into the Argonautica, I think I'm going to offer a class at some point on the Argonautica, but you will see that this is a story that in no way, shape, or form could have any kind of actual evidential truth to it, as it is with a lot of these stories. The Trojan War, there is some archaeological evidence to suggest that some kind of war happened that maybe this is based on, but the Golden Fleece story is pretty transparently not meant to be historical, but Herodotus talks about it in that way. Okay, anyway, sorry, that's kind of a long preface there. So what Herodotus tells us about Helen is that the abduction of her by Paris was said, now according to him, this was told to him by the Persians, and he expresses whether, he does not know whether or not they are reliable narrators. But he said, anyway, according to them, when Paris abducted Helen, that this was considered to be in recompense for when Jason took Medea in the Argonautica. So as you notice here, as I'm talking about the story of Theseus and Paris, that Theseus leaves her with his mother Aethra, and that Castor and Pollux, when they bring their retrieve their sister, also take Aethra. Like there's this idea of tit for tat. When you ransom one, you can take another in exchange. We see it at the beginning of the Iliad, when Agamemnon is forced to return Chryseis to her father after Apollo brings a plague on the Achaeans, after he refuses to accept a ransom from the father of what he brings him, all these gifts that he can have, and he refuses them. Then he decides he is instead going to take a reparation by taking Achilles' concubine, Briseis. So there's this idea of, if somebody has a woman as either that they've abducted her or she's a spoil of war, or this is simply their, this seems to be a thing about, same way as I think of the Celtic cattle raids and things like that. Now, obviously, we're not talking about the Celts and we're not talking about Irish myth, but it does remind me of the idea that one is, does this by kind of shows their strength or their royal lineage or their ability to be a king by their ability to loot from other tribes. That seems to be a thing that we see, and certainly this is something that goes on when we're talking about the Greek nations or Greek tribes and their connection to their neighbors in Asia Minor and probably North Africa and around those areas. So Helen is returned home after this. Now, when it comes time for Helen to be married, it says that there were many kings and princes from around the world came to seek her hand, bringing rich gifts or sending emissaries to do so on their behalf. During the contest, Castor and Pollux played a prominent role in dealing with the suitors, although the final decision was in the hands of Tyndareus, who of course is considered to be her father. Menelaus, her future husband, did not attend, but sent his brother Agamemnon, who later marries Clytemnestra, to represent him. He was chosen as he had the most wealth. So Helen is married to him, and it basically, this is always an interesting way of doing things. It's a sort of marriage by being sold to the highest bidder. I actually have a thing about this in part of the Morrigan timelines too. There's this idea of being sold to the highest bidder, and it kind of a reminder that the marriage contract really initially is that kind of a thing. It's really a financial arrangement between families. But as we can see here, Helen does not really have any autonomy to pick who she would prefer. She is married off to the guy who has the most money. And I wonder often if that part of the psychology that we have, or that men may have, around how much money they have and the marriage of women, or their ability to marry a woman, or the idea that if I come to her and I show her or brag to her about my stock portfolio, or show her that I have a lot of money, that's going to be the thing that's going to make her want to be with me. And I wonder, I feel like that idea is kind of a cultural carryover from this, even though probably now for maybe not 1,000 years, but pretty close to it, probably at least several hundred years, we have had more the tradition of marriage being a love match. And it would be kind of interesting, actually, to do a side podcast or something. Maybe I do it for Patreon on the ideas about marriage and how that affects ideas about love. Like I remember when I did the one on the Irish vampires, there was this idea of the beautiful girl who is married off to this disgusting old man, but he had the most money, and that's what her father was really after. And then, of course, he kind of keeps her locked up like she's a possession, and she starves herself to death and turns into a vampire, who then kills him and his and him and his father, and her father too, I think, actually, for doing that. So yeah, you can get back to ideas about sovereignty, but you also have the idea of the woman who is, for example, falls in love with the poor shepherd, or something like that. The man who really loves her but doesn't have the money, so he is not able to make the match. We've seen this in reverse too. Like if I think about the La Llorona, or La Llorona, depending on how you want to say that, that's actually a reverse of it, where she is the lover of a very wealthy man and has children with him, but she is not considered to be a suitable wife because she does not have the appropriate dowry and so he is married instead to somebody of means, while she is kind of left hanging, really. And very interesting how you think about this idea of the marriage contract. Now, I don't want to diverge too much into that topic, but when I think about Helen and I think about her marriage, you do want to wonder about whether her marriage to Menelaus is all that solid, because it could be that, she's just married to him, again, because he has the money, but is there any actual affection there? Is there love there? Now, with the marriage of Helen, it comes the oath of Tyndareus, and so he was afraid to select a husband for his daughter, or sending any of the suitors away for fear of offending them or giving grounds for a quarrel. Odysseus was one of the suitors, but had brought no gifts because he believed he had little chance to win the contest. He thus promised to solve the problem. If Tyndareus in turn would support him in the courting of Penelope, the daughter of Icarius, basically, now remember, Odysseus is somebody who is known to be a negotiator. He is beloved of Athena for his skills in negotiation, and he's almost a real mercurial Gemini type character himself, because he can talk out of both sides of his mouth, and he can pretend to be something in a situation just to kind of get things a certain way. So it does make sense that Odysseus would be the clever one. Odysseus actually means trouble. The name actually means trouble. So he said, before the decision was made, all suitors should swear a most solemn oath to defend the chosen husband against whoever should quarrel with him. After the suitors had sworn not to retaliate, Menelaus was chosen because he was greatest in possession and had offered the most gifts. As a sign of the importance of the pact, Tyndareus sacrificed a horse. Helen and Menelaus became the rulers of Sparta after Tyndareus and Leda abdicated. Okay, so we see where this comes in. Menelaus and Helen rule Sparta for at least 10 years and have a daughter, Hermione, who, according to some myths, has 3 sons, Aeolus, Mariphius, and Pleisthenes. Okay, and there is a story about Hermione and her marriage to the son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, but she is actually in love with Orestes, who is the child of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. So, and there is actually a play about, it's about the concubine of Neoptolemus, Andromache. So, yeah, there is a play called Andromache by, I believe that's a Euripides play. And Andromache is one of the princesses of Troy who is taken as loot after the Achaean League wins the battle with Troy and lays siege to Troy. All of the women are made into slaves or concubines, and she becomes the concubine of Neoptolemus, who is married to Hermione, the daughter of Helen and Menelaus. And Menelaus actually doesn't come across very well in the Andromache play. In fact, Euripides is quite sympathetic to Andromache in this play, because she has a child with Neoptolemus, but Hermione is not able to produce a child. And so she accuses Andromache of witchcraft, and she's going to slaughter her and her son, and this and that and the other. And in any case, Neoptolemus goes away on a pretext to the Temple of Apollo, and ends up, a rumor is started that gets the townspeople turned against him. He's killed. And so then she ends up running off to marry Orestes, which is just who she wanted to marry in the first place. So, interesting stuff, all these kind of marriage intrigue with these. But the Oath of Tyndareus is so this is contrived by Odysseus, and actually works quite well, in the sense that now all the other men have just said, whoever is chosen, we're going to accept that choice. They're not going to go to war with somebody to take Helen away. So, now we get to the judgment of Paris, as we talked about. And Paris judges Aphrodite to be the fairest of the 3, and thus the winner of the golden apple, because she offers him Helen as his wife. So, yeah, this is listed as the seduction or kidnapping by Paris, because this is where we're not really sure. So it says, Paris, a Trojan prince, came to Sparta to claim Helen in the guise of a supposed diplomatic mission. Before this journey, Paris had been appointed by Zeus to judge the most beautiful goddess, Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite. He's swayed by Aphrodite's offer because, honestly, Paris, if you see him as he's described in the Iliad, it's not that Paris has no fighting skills, but it's very clear that he would much rather be off somewhere making love than making war, which, you can look at things one way or the other. But just somebody, he's just kind of a pretty boy. He's just very, there's just something about him. Even when he goes out to do battle, he says a lot of words, but then because initially they try to solve the war by having Paris go into hand-to-hand combat with Menelaus, and he says, yes, of course, I will do this, and Hector goes, bravo, let's prevent the war, and then Paris gets swept away by Aphrodite back into the bedroom with Helen. And Aphrodite is not very kind to Helen in this. When she is in the castle of King Priam, lets it be known that she is not really truly happy to be there, or at least that's what the Iliad says, and that Aphrodite basically says to her, hold your tongue, because I could make life miserable for you. Because when you're that beautiful of a woman, you would think that you have the goddess of love on your side, but if we also look at the story of Psyche, you realize that being a very beautiful woman is actually very dangerous in the eyes of Aphrodite. She does not want any competition in terms of her... in terms of being the most beautiful. It almost makes us think of the whole Snow White, who's the fairest of them all, right? But, of course, Aphrodite's not the mother of Helen. It's not an analogy that holds up word for word, but nonetheless, you do have this idea of women being competitive over who is the most beautiful. It's almost as though Aphrodite treats Helen as though Helen is her property to move around as she wishes, which is kind of interesting. And that Helen's point of view in the whole thing does not seem to be taken into account. However, if you read Euripides' play, The Trojan Women, you get kind of a different view. Euripides, again, does not seem to be terribly favorable towards Helen. The Cypriaja says, after giving Helen gifts, Aphrodite brings the Spartan queen together with the prince of Troy. Now, for Aphrodite to bring them together, there is a suggestion there that there is actual love, or that there is an actual seduction. Apollodorus says Paris persuaded Helen to leave with him, and Sappho argues that Helen willingly left behind Menelaus and their daughter Hermione to be with Paris. And so Sappho says, I'll read her fragment, some say a host of horsemen, others of infantry, and others of ships is the most beautiful thing on dark earth, but I say it is what you love. Full easy it is to make this understood of one and all, for she that far surpassed all mortals in beauty, Helen, her most noble husband, deserted and went sailing to Troy with never a thought for her daughter and dear parents. So Sappho making the point that if you think that all of these things that people think represent what women desire in men, or what is going to be the thing that a woman is going to want. They're saying, it doesn't matter how many horses you have, doesn't matter how much wealth you have, doesn't matter if you're a great warrior and fought in a great battle. It is love that is going to make that decision. And interestingly, that kind of reflects the judgment of Paris, because what happens there, you have Hera who offers Paris basically that she's going to make him a great king, right? He's going to have much wealth and a great kingdom and be a great ruler. You have Athena who offers him prowess in battle, that he's going to be a great warrior, and his name's going to be remembered. And then you have Aphrodite who offers him love. Okay, and it's interesting because it's almost the idea that love is such a potent force that it overrides any of these other material considerations, or any of the normal, I don't know, you might call them the sensible qualifications for a marriage, right? When you are, when you think about somebody, it's like, okay, am I going to marry the poor guy? A lot of times women are still discouraged from marrying men who don't seem like they have careers that make a lot of money. The poor poet who is... who lusts after his muse, kind of unrequited, that he can't have because this ideal of a woman, because he materially doesn't measure up. Or you do think about these, the kind of movies where you talk about, I always think about these tropes about the popular and the unpopular kids. And, the unpopular one becomes popular when they do something great to get noticed, like, they go on a team and they hit the winning run, or they... I don't know. They just do some kind of a thing that people look up and then go, oh, wow, they can do this great thing. So then all of a sudden, the nerdy kid who's pushed around suddenly is beloved of everybody based on some of these characteristics. I mean, I'm just relating this to some of these tropes that we see, not only in movies, but even in some of the teen literature that I remember seeing in the 80s and things like that. It's interesting. It's this idea that it is love. And it is desire, whether it's true love or whether it's purely lust. I mean, I've talked, actually, I do have a whole podcast called What's War Got to Do with It? And it actually does address this issue. It does address actually this story as well to some degree. And the idea is that when you the things that people do for love, the reason Aphrodite and many other goddesses, for example, goddesses like Ishtar in the Babylonian mythology or mythos, is they're often connected to war, is because this idea that when one falls in love, that drive, that desire for the woman or for the man, I mean, it can go either way, but if you're talking about a situation where people are going to war, typically it's a man who desires a certain woman. And as part of that seduction, the man may do things, may take great risks, and has the potential to lose everything. The reverse can also be true. A woman in falling in love with somebody, or say going against her parents' wishes, or something in one of these stories, can also be in a position where she risks losing her family and losing her support and losing these things if she doesn't do what the family wants. And again, in all of these stories, it's interesting because you see the woman, no matter who she is. First of all, she's valued based on her physical beauty, but may also be valued on her position and her status, right? So that's why everybody jockeys for position and for status and continually fretting about how beautiful they are physically, right? The idea is that you are making this kind of match. This is where the whole thing about virginity would come in. Certainly in some cultures, that they want a woman who is, pristine. I've even seen this in certain memes, certain men using this metaphor of, would you want to, if you saw this beautiful car that you bought, and you found out suddenly that it had 100,000 miles on it when you bought it brand new, and I'm like thinking, yeah, this is the same way people are still thinking about beautiful women and about where the value is in the beautiful woman, and it has to do with whether or not she's a virgin, and whether or not these things are actually pretty ridiculous. And all of them treat a woman exactly like that, like she's a car you've purchased. Because all of this still, consciously, unconsciously, intentionally or not, is still thought of as this kind of, like the woman is property. And like this is a financial exchange of some kind. Like, oh, you're marrying me, and now I have to support you financially, so I expect you to do X, Y, and Z. And it's funny how these expectations still exist, even if the woman is the one who's supporting the man. And oftentimes the man resents her because they will say, well, it's my job to support you. And it's like, but you're not. Anyway, it's the story of Helen makes me think a lot about this idea of marriage customs, and the way in which women can be viewed as property, and women who seem to have a value in terms of great beauty and perhaps great wealth can literally be the center of a war that is so massive that it wipes out so many people and destroys great cities. And this really makes you think about the power of the anima, right? When we talk about the anima and the animus and the soul projections and so forth, we kind of we talk about it in these archetypal psychological terms that maybe minimize it in some way. It sounds a little too abstract and a little too theoretical. But the person who actually falls in love is actually experiencing a kind of psychosis. It is literally a soul psychosis. It is where you see the beloved and you are absolutely caught up in that person. And you are absolutely, it does something to you physically. It can do something mentally, emotionally, spiritually. It is that drive towards the other in a way that, again, for some people, maybe it is purely physical, but if somebody who would go to all of those kinds of lengths, because it has to be something that makes their own soul feel completely lifted up. But as we know, when you are doing that as a means of projection, you're not acknowledging that you are projecting something onto another person that they can never live up to. I mean, this is Greek mythology, but here's Helen, and she's the most beautiful woman in the world. And yeah, she's married off to a guy who just has the most money. We don't really know whether she loves Menelaus because, again, the different writings give a different perspective. In the Trojan Women, when Helen approaches him at the end of the war, he is furious with her. But she manages to seduce him into, not killing her. Like Aphrodite stays his hand and says, "You're not going to kill her," because he feels that she has betrayed him. And so it's very clear that he feels that she yielded to the seduction of Paris, and thus caused all of this damage. And when we think, interestingly, in our archetypes about women who are quote unquote homewreckers, right? or women who are somehow, no matter what happens to the woman, there's this attitude of, yes, but she must have done something to make him be out of his head, right? So it's never the man's fault, it's always the woman's fault when we hear in a lot of these stories, right? Now, again, we're moving into an era where those narratives seem to be changing, but when you have this idea of the woman who is, if she has something great like that, if she has a great beauty, if she has that great power of seduction, then she is considered to be a danger. She's somebody who is supposed to be put in a proper marriage so that she is not a threat. But there's always a threat. And it's so interesting that she has a child with Menelaus, Hermione, but that these other children that may have been attributed to Menelaus having sex with other women. So it's like, okay, he's got the most beautiful woman in the world, but that's not good enough for him, which is the other problem of the drama of the Anonymous, is that when you withdraw the projection, then you start looking for it somewhere else. Now she's just a regular person and not this beautiful goddess. And you really feel like, you don't know if they're going to war because he loves Helen so much, because you really don't hear anything about how he feels about her throughout the war. It's more of the idea of, this is my property, and you've taken it from me. So, I don't know. The stories of Helen are quite interesting in that way. Okay, so there's some other texts here, which I'm going to talk about briefly. In Egypt, it said at least 3 ancient Greek authors denied Helen ever went to Troy. Instead, they suggested she stayed in Egypt during the Trojan War, and those are Euripides, Stesichorus, and Herodotus. In the version put forth by Euripides in his play Helen, Hera fashioned a likeness of Helen out of clouds at Zeus's request. Hermes took her back to Egypt, and Helen never went to Troy but spent the entire war in Egypt. And Eidolon, which is, there's the Psyche and the Eidolon. The Eidolon is like this shadowy double of yourself, is also present in Stesichorus' account, but not in Herodotus' rationalizing of the myth. In addition to these, Lycophron states that Hesiod was the first to mention Helen's Eidolon. This may mean Hesiod stated this in a literary work, or that the idea was known in early archaic Greece during the time of Hesiod and consequently attributed to him. So this is another version where Helen never ran off with Paris at all, but rather, basically he got duped by this cloud version of her that he took away. So in other words, almost like, Paris came and what he took away was actually a phantasm or a fantasy and not the real thing at all, which could have a lot of symbolisms as well. Actually, to me, there's a lot of animus symbolism there. It's the idea that, no, this isn't the real woman that you've loved. What makes her beautiful is what you've projected onto her image, okay, the thing that you see. You've heard the expression, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. And you can take somebody who could be a reasonably average-looking person, and if somebody sees a quality in them that really ignites their soul, when that gets projected outward, that other person is the most beautiful woman in the world. Or, conversely, when that happens with a man, the man could be the most beautiful person in the world. Until you actually get to know them and you withdraw the projection, in which case then either real love remains or it doesn't. But it usually starts with that kind of projection. During the fall of Troy, okay, so Helen's role here is ambiguous. Again, I'm just kind of reading more from this article. It says, Virgil's Aeneid, Deiphobus gives an account of Helen's treacherous stance. When the Trojan horse was admitted to the city, she feigned the Bacchic rites. Leading a chorus of Trojan women and holding a torch among them, she signaled the Greeks from the city's central tower. In the Odyssey, however, Homer narrates a different story. Helen circled the horse 3 times and imitated the voices of the Greek women left behind at home. She thus tortured the men inside, including Odysseus and Menelaus, with the memory of their loved ones and brought them to the brink of destruction. So this is interesting, too, because now it's like, whose side is Helen on? And depending on the writer and their perspective on her and her role in the whole situation, she's represented differently. She seems to have this kind of siren-like quality to her. Like, she is the feminine that's going to lead to your destruction. It says, after the deaths of Hector and Paris, Helen became the paramour of their younger brother Deiphobus. But when the sack of Troy began, she hid her new husband's sword and left him to the mercy of Menelaus and Odysseus. In the Aeneid, Aeneas meets the mutilated Deiphobus in Hades. His wounds serve as a testimony to his ignominious end, abetted by Helen's final act of treachery. Again, the portraits of her are contradictory. We read about the treacherous Helen who simulated Bacchic rites and then rejoiced over the carnage of Trojans. On the other hand, there's another Helen, lonely and helpless, desperate to find sanctuary while Troy is on fire. Stesichorus narrates that both Greeks and Trojans gathered to stone her to death, but when Menelaus found her, he raised his sword to kill her. He demanded only that he should slay his unfaithful wife, but when he was ready to do so, she dropped her robe from her shoulders, and the sight of her beauty caused him to let the sword drop from his hand. Electra wails, "Alas for my troubles! Can it be that her beauty has blunted their swords?" So, yeah, Helen is truly an embodiment of the animus in every way, and I think all of these stories end up kind of representing that. And, so she does return to Sparta. She's the wife of Menelaus, and when you read Book 4 of the Odyssey, it's a rather interesting exchange between the two of them. Supposedly they're reconciled, have a harmonious life, he's not holding any grudge, and she feels no restraint in telling anecdotes of her life inside besieged Troy. However, I have read the translations of the Book 4 of the Odyssey. Again, I usually use the Fagles translation, but I've also familiar with some other ones. And I don't know, I feel like there's a little bit of a passive-aggressive edge in Menelaus' conversation with her, or the conversation back and forth, like, no, of course I'm not annoyed that you did this thing. There's something about it where he's just kind of smiling graciously, but there's kind of an edge underneath it. So I don't know. It's something it seems like he's reconciled himself to because he now has her back. And yeah, and of course, now he's... Sometimes when you are in a situation and you are no longer in the situation of loss, you can completely forget about what happened before. So, it's entirely possible, I suppose. So yeah, there's a number of other stories about this. Euripides' Trojan women. Helen is shunned by the women who survived the war and is to be taken back to Greece to face a death sentence. And this version is contradicted by two of the other tragedies, Electra and Helen, as Helen is described as being in Egypt in each one of them. So yeah, Greek mythology is always rife with different stories. You're not going to have the same stories. You can have the same myth, and you could have a number of different versions of that myth. So I will frequently teach a version of a myth in a class, and people will say, well, wait, I thought this is what happened, or this is what happened. And then, of course, you've got the Disneyfying of things, which just muddies the waters, really. Because I'm like, no, if that happened in a Disney movie, then it most certainly was not part of an ancient Greek text. But the Greeks and Romans, they all had these different interpretations, and the different interpretations might tell you something about their attitudes towards the situation. Because, again, when you have this idea of a war that's precipitated over a woman, and mind you, the reason that they're all going to war is because of the oath of Tyndareus. So Odysseus really indirectly is another cause of this war, because now they are all bound by oath to go to war on behalf of Menelaus to bring Helen back home again. And so because of this is where she becomes the epicenter of this whole drama. And she's represented differently by different authors. Sometimes she is sitting there lonely, wishing she could be back home. In the Iliad, it certainly doesn't seem like she has any real love for Paris. But on the other hand, you see her behaving in ways that seem to be devious. Again, which is the machinations of the anima. And you think about the kind of games that people play in seduction games. And she may be a representation of that. Even the version that says that he only took away a cloud or an eidolon or some version of her while the real Helen remained in Egypt, that also may be representative not only of the fact that she really is an anima. There's, to a certain degree, the anima has no substance. It is just something that is projected. And men who project the anima in this way do not have a recognition of what it says about themselves, about what it means about their own soul, or about what inspires their own soul. They expect, I think it was Robert Johnson, who's one of the Jungian analysts, who had said, they expect the woman to bear the anima for them, and the woman can't. The anima will never live up to the version of what the human woman is, because it's just not realistic. And the fact that he sees Helen as a cloud may also suggest that his vision is not realistic. And ultimately that he has been chasing a shadow. When he had a choice in the judgment of Paris, he chose the thing that is the most fleeting. So, interesting things to think about. Helen is, it's interesting to see that connection of her to Nemesis. And you can kind of understand it in this context, because she really becomes whatever people see. Like, the idea that Hesiod would make her into someone who is more devious would make sense, because Hesiod doesn't like women. He's very clear In his catalog of women, he's very clear in Works and Days and other places that he does not have a very high regard for women. So writers that were more inclined in that direction are not going to be as sympathetic. Euripides doesn't seem to be very charitable towards her either. He usually tends to be charitable to the underdog or to the loser. Like, he is very charitable to the Trojan women who are taken away in a lot of these plays that he has written. But I think it could tell you a lot about judgments of women, judgments of the seductive powers of women, and how people see it, whether they see it sympathetically or whether they see it as a treachery, whether they see it as an evil. You have these different perspectives. But nonetheless, I do think the idea of Helen as really being a cloud, while Paris only took away an image and not the real woman, even though this is not the story that we see in the majority, it definitely seems to be the one that, psychologically at least, makes the most sense. So thank you so much for listening. If you do enjoy this podcast, please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia to help me support these works. I will be making some major changes to Chthonia over this summer and by the end of 2025. So stay tuned for those to find out more about what changes are upcoming. There's just a tremendous amount going on right now, and I don't want to make any announcements about anything until I really know exactly what's going on. But if you do want to follow me on social media, I am Chthonia Podcast, one word, on Instagram and also on Facebook. You shows up at 2 words, Chthonia Podcast. YouTube at Chthonia Podcast, one word, youtube.com/@Chthonia Podcast. You can find me there. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.